The storm had picked up earlier that evening, just as I was leaving a little town called Birchwood Hollow. It was one of those blink and you'll miss it places, a gas station, a diner, and a motel that hadn't been updated since bell-bottoms were in style. I'd stopped there the night before, hoping to rest before the last stretch of my drive to Rockford. I didn't sleep much. The room was clean enough, but there was this faint mildew smell that clung to everything. It felt like the walls had soaked up decades of bad weather and bad memories. The radiator buzzed all night, its grating hum enough to make earplugs useless. By the next evening, I'd had enough. I convinced myself I could make it to the next town, or maybe even all the way home if I just pushed through. The snow didn't look so bad at first. Famous last words, right? By the time I hit the highway, the world had become a swirling sea of white. Snowflakes weren't just falling, they were attacking the windshield, piling up faster than the wipers could clear them. My headlights barely cut through the dark, and the road ahead was more guesswork than anything else. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I was so focused on getting out of Birchwood Hollow, so convinced I could handle it, that I pressed on. Classic me, always thinking I could tough it out. It must have been close to midnight when I first saw the car. Its taillights appeared out of nowhere, two dim red eyes glowing faintly through the snow. For a moment I felt relief, someone else braving the storm. But as I got closer, that relief turned to unease. The car wasn't moving. It was parked on the shoulder, tilted awkwardly with one wheel sunk into a ditch. The driver's door was wide open, swinging in the wind like it was waving me down. Snow was piling inside the cabin, covering the seat and dashboard in a thin, powdery layer. The engine wasn't running, and there was no smoke from the exhaust. Whoever had been driving was gone. I slowed down, my tires crunching over the icy road. My headlights lit up the scene, a silver sedan, maybe a Honda or Toyota. Hard to tell with all the snow. I scanned the area for movement. Nothing. No other cars, no tracks on the road, no figure trudging through the snow ahead. Just the car, sitting there like some forgotten relic. I rolled down my window, immediately regretting it when the icy wind hit me like a slap. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small against the howling storm. Nothing answered, not even an echo. I debated driving on. It wasn't my problem, right? Maybe the driver had already gotten a ride or walked to a house nearby. But something about the scene didn't sit right. The open door, the way the car seemed so lonely and abandoned. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove box, I stepped out. The cold hit like a punch to the chest. The snow was deeper than I'd thought, almost to my knees in some places, and each step felt like a battle. "Hello!" I shouted again, louder this time. Still nothing. The car looked worse up close. The driver's seat was empty, but there was a thermos in the cup holder, its contents frozen solid. A road atlas lay open on the passenger seat, its pages curled at the edges from the cold. A red marker had circled a town about 30 miles ahead. Whoever had been driving had a plan, a destination. So where were they? Then I saw the footprints. A single set, fresh and sharp, leading away from the car and into the woods. My flashlight followed their path, the beam bouncing off the snow-covered ground. The tracks disappeared into the dark tangle of trees. I stared at them, my stomach tightening. Someone had walked into the forest alone, at night, in the middle of a storm. Every instinct told me to turn back. Any sane person would have. But what if they were hurt? Lost? Lying in the snow just beyond the trees? I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The moment I crossed the tree line, everything changed. The wind, so fierce on the road, became a faint whisper. Snow fell softer, landing in delicate piles. It should have felt peaceful, but it wasn't. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heart race. The footprints were easy to follow at first, spaced evenly like the person had been walking calmly. But as I went deeper, they began to stagger, veering left and right. The snow was churned up in places, like they'd tripped or stumbled, and then they stopped. I froze, shining my flashlight ahead. The tracks ended in the middle of a small clearing where the snow was disturbed, uneven, like there'd been a struggle. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. The clearing was empty. No sign of the person, no continuation of the tracks. And then I saw it. Something small and shiny, half buried in the snow. I crouched down, brushing the powder away. It was a keychain, a plastic bear, the kind you'd find in a gas station gift shop. Its edges were scratched, and there was a dark, dried stain on it that I didn't need a lab to identify. That's when I heard the sound. It started low, like a hum, before growing into an awful, mournful wail. It wasn't human. It was deep and raw, like something that had never learned to scream properly. My flashlight jerked wildly as I spun around. For a split second, the beam caught a shadow, tall, thin, and wrong. It moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. The snow made every step a struggle, but I didn't care. The wailing grew louder behind me. I could hear footsteps, no, something heavier, crunching through the snow. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out onto the road. My car was still there, engine idling, headlights cutting through the storm. I scrambled inside, slamming the door and locking it with shaking hands. For a moment, I just sat there trying to catch my breath. Then I saw it. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the headlights, it stood, impossibly tall, its head tilted to one side like it was studying me. And then, just like that, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached Rockford. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The next day, the police found the car buried under fresh snow. No footprints, no keychain, no sign of the driver. It was like nothing had ever been there at all, but I know what I saw. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind picks up just right, I swear I can still hear that wailing. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. The heater in my truck wheezed and rattled like it was ready to give out. Weak puffs of lukewarm air struggled against the frost creeping over the windshield. Outside, the world was an endless expanse of white, a blur of snow-covered trees and barren hills stretching under a heavy gray sky that felt like it might collapse at any moment. After hours of driving through this monotony, it was starting to mess with my head. Sam sat in the passenger seat, bundled in a massive parka that swallowed him whole. He looked small in it, almost childlike, except for the sharpness in his eyes. They darted between the crumpled map on his lap and the road ahead. He hadn't said much since we left Redford, aside from muttering the occasional direction or grunt. Not exactly the lively road trip I'd imagined when I signed up for this job. Not that I expected fun, but still. "You sure this is the right way?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us like an unwelcome passenger. My voice sounded louder than I intended. "It's right," Sam said curtly, tracing something on the map with a gloved finger. "Just keep going. We're close." He'd been saying that for the past 2 hours. I bit back a sarcastic reply. Something about him made me hesitate. Maybe the way he gripped the map like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Or the tightness in his jaw that hadn't eased since we left. He had this nervous energy that set my own nerves on edge. I tightened my grip on the wheel, focusing on the road, or what was left of it. Calling it a road felt generous. The farther we went, the narrower it got, until it was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the snow. The trees were different here too, taller, older, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. The air felt heavier, colder, as though we'd crossed an invisible boundary into another world. "You still haven't told me what's so important about this place," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "It's personal," Sam muttered, his eyes glued to the map. He traced the outline of a red circle, his finger lingering like it held some secret only he could understand. "My uncle used to bring me here when I was a kid." I raised an eyebrow but didn't press him. Sam wasn't exactly a sharer. Still, the way he said personal sent a ripple of unease through me. What kind of memory could drag someone out to the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter? The highway gave way to a dirt road that hadn't seen a plow in years. Snow crunched under the tires as the truck jolted over frozen ruts, the suspension groaning in protest. The forest pressed in on either side, the trees so close they formed a tunnel. It was the kind of road you don't take unless you have a damn good reason. Even then, you think twice. "You sure this is it?" I asked, slowing to a crawl. Sam glanced between the map and his GPS. "Yeah, keep going. The cabin's just ahead." The word cabin gave me a flicker of relief. 4 walls, a roof, maybe even a fireplace. But as we crept deeper into the woods, that flicker started to fade. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the headlights, and the path was nearly impossible to navigate. My gut screamed at me to turn back, but I ignored it. The pay was good, too good. If Sam wasn't worried, I figured I shouldn't be either. When the cabin finally came into view, I almost laughed. It wasn't a cabin. It was a shack, an old, miserable structure that looked like it might collapse if I sneezed too hard. The wood was warped and splintered, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow. One of the windows was broken, jagged edges catching the light like teeth. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking whenever the wind gusted. "This is it?" I asked, throwing the truck into park. Sam nodded, already unbuckling his seatbelt. Without a word, he climbed out and trudged toward the shack, his boots crunching in the snow. I stayed in the truck, watching him. There was something about the way he moved, quick and almost frantic, that put me on edge. "Great," I muttered, pulling on my gloves. Home sweet home. The cold hit like a slap as I stepped out. The wind sliced through my layers, sharp and unforgiving. My breath fogged in the icy air as I followed Sam. He stood in the doorway, staring inside, unmoving. "You good?" I called, but he didn't answer. His face was pale and tight, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I reached him and followed his gaze. The inside was as sad as the outside. Bare walls, a rickety table, and 2 chairs that looked like they'd crumble under any weight. Dust coated everything, and the air smelled stale, like the place hadn't been touched in years. "It's not her," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "What's not her?" I asked, but he was already moving. He headed straight for the back wall, running his hands over the wood like he was searching for something. "Sam," I said, sharper this time, "what's going on?" "It's not the cabin," he said, turning to me with wide, glassy eyes. "It's up there." He pointed to a ridge barely visible through the swirling snow. I stared at it, my stomach sinking. "What's up there?" Sam didn't answer. He grabbed his pack and started toward the ridge. For a moment I considered leaving, but then I sighed, muttered a curse, and followed him. The climb was brutal. The snow was deeper than it looked, and the wind howled like an angry spirit. My legs burned, and my fingers were numb despite my gloves. By the time we reached the top, I was ready to collapse. But then I saw it, a strange, uneven mound in the snow. At first, it looked like just another drift, but as I stared, I realized it wasn't natural. Sam dropped his pack and began digging, frantic and wild. "What are you doing?" I grabbed his arm. "It's her," he said, his voice shaking. "I know it's her." "Sam, what the hell are you talking about?" He didn't answer. He just kept digging. Against my better judgment, I helped. After what felt like forever, we uncovered it. A rusted steel hatch, half buried in the frozen ground. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Sam didn't respond. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The hatch groaned, reluctant to open, but eventually gave way. A blast of air hit us, cold and foul, carrying a stench that made me gag. "Sam," I said, stepping back, "we need to leave." But he was already climbing down the ladder. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. It was late, much later than I had planned for us to still be on the road. The silence around us had taken on an unnatural weight, pressing against my chest, making every breath feel heavier. You'd think the snow would soften the world, muffling the night into something peaceful, but it wasn't like that. It felt like the world was holding its breath, watching, waiting. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Beside me, my brother Nate had his old beat-up atlas open on his lap. The faded lines of the map traced routes long outdated, but Nate swore by it. GPS isn't real navigation, he'd always say. Normally I'd make some joke about his ancient relic, but not tonight. Tonight I couldn't bring myself to care. My whole focus was on the narrow, snow-covered road ahead, where faint tire tracks faded beneath the falling snow. "There's a sharp curve coming up," Nate said. His voice was calm, too calm, like he was hiding his unease. "I see it," I muttered. My voice was quiet, barely a whisper, as I squinted to make out the curve he'd mentioned. In the back seat, the kids were bundled up in blankets, their small forms slumped against each other. Emma, my oldest, had her face turned to the window, her eyes closed, or at least I thought they were. Knowing her, she was probably pretending to sleep, waiting for the perfect moment to ask one of those questions kids always seem to know how to ask at the worst times. The heater wheezed faintly, struggling to push out warmth. The cold crept in anyway, seeping through the windows and wrapping around my legs like a living thing. Nate's fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the map, a habit he'd had since we were kids. I finally glanced at him. "What's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Nate tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" He paused. "I don't know. It sounded like someone yelling." I laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." I reached over to turn down the faint hum of static on the radio, and for a moment, the silence felt sharper, almost alive. But then I heard it too, a faint sound, distant and distorted. It could have been a voice, or maybe my imagination. "Pull over," Nate said suddenly. "What, out here?" My heart was already racing. "Are you serious?" "Just pull over," he insisted, his voice tight with urgency. Reluctantly, I eased the car onto the snowy shoulder. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating skeletal trees. Nate opened the door without another word, and a rush of cold air filled the car. "Stay here," he said, stepping out into the night without so much as a flashlight. I watched him disappear into the darkness at the edge of the woods, my stomach twisting into a knot. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the car eerily quiet. The heater's weak hum did little to fill the void. "Where's Uncle Nate going?" Emma's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her wide brown eyes were filled with fear. "He's just checking something," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "He'll be back in a minute." But he wasn't. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The longer I sat there, the heavier the air in the car seemed to get. Something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and turned to Emma. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Understand?" Her lip trembled, but she nodded. "Don't be long, Dad." Stepping out of the car, the cold hit me like a wall of needles. The wind had picked up, carrying with it that faint sound again, a cry, or maybe a moan. My breath clouded in the air as I called out, "Nate, where are you?" The woods loomed in front of me, dark and uninviting. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling my footsteps as I approached the tree line. I shone the flashlight into the shadows, the beam trembling in my unsteady grip. "Nate!" I called again, my voice cracking. Then I heard it, a low, guttural noise that didn't sound human. My heart leapt into my throat. The sound came again, louder this time, sending ice down my spine. And then I saw him, or at least, I thought it was him. He was crouched near a tree, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. Relief surged through me, and I started toward him. "Nate, what the hell are you doing? You scared me half to two." I stuttered. He turned. Slowly. Too slowly. The movement was wrong, jerky and unnatural. And when his face came into the light, I realized it wasn't Nate at all. The thing crouched before me had skin stretched too tight over angular bones, its eyes two black voids that seemed to swallow the light, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. It let out a sound, a horrible, inhuman shriek that pierced the air and froze me in place. I didn't think. I ran. Crashing through the underbrush, the flashlight slipped from my hand, plunging the woods into darkness. The scream followed me, growing louder, closer, until I burst out onto the road. My chest heaving, I threw myself into the car and locked the door behind me. "Drive!" Emma cried, her voice trembling with terror. "Where's Uncle Nate?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I slammed the car into drive, the tires spinning before finding traction. We sped off into the night, snow whipping past the windows, the creature's shriek still echoing in my ears.